Welcome to our deep dive on anxiety. Yeah, anxiety. We're going to kind of unpack this complex emotion, explore its nuances, and see what we can learn from it. We've got this fascinating collection of YouTube videos from channels like Psych2Go, Jordan B. Peterson, TEDx Talks, and Mel Robbins. Really is an interesting mix of perspectives on this topic. I think you'll find pretty insightful.
It's fascinating how anxiety is often painted as the villain, you know, in our lives, but it's actually like a fundamental part of the human experience.
That's true. Instead of just trying to banish it, maybe we can try to understand what it's trying to tell us.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe we can even learn to use it to our advantage.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
And it starts with recognizing that anxiety isn't a monolithic thing. It manifests in different ways, and understanding those nuances is key.
Okay.
For example, we often talk about anxiety in a general sense, but have you ever considered the different types of anxiety, like social anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just like a one-size-fits-all, right?
Exactly. And diving a bit deeper, we can even look at the neurological basis of anxiety. It involves complex interactions between neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine, as well as specific brain regions like the amygdala and the hippocampus.
So it's not just some vague feeling, it's literally happening in our brains.
Precisely. And I think Psych2Go does a good job of laying out the basics. They explain that anxiety is essentially a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, usually about something with an uncertain outcome. But the key distinction they make is between normal anxiety and anxiety disorders.
Right, because a little anxiety can actually be helpful, like when it keeps us alert and motivated. But when it starts to take over and interfere with our daily lives, that's when it crosses the line into an anxiety disorder.
And that's where understanding its message becomes crucial. In one of the TEDx talks we have, Tim Box makes this really interesting argument that anxiety isn't an illness, but a vital emotion, a signal that something is important and needs our attention.
I like how he uses the analogy of a ship and its crew. Our conscious mind is the captain steering toward our goals, but it's the crew, our subconscious and emotions that are actually running the ship. Anxiety is like a crew member frantically trying to warn the captain about a potential problem.
It's a great metaphor because it highlights that we shouldn't just try to silence the messenger. Instead, we need to figure out what the message is and how to address it.
So what kinds of messages might anxiety be trying to send?
Well, Psych2Go suggests a few possibilities. Maybe you're feeling stuck in a rut and your anxiety is a nudge to explore new challenges or hobbies. Think about it. Why might that be? Could it be a sign that you're craving novelty or that you haven't found a sense of purpose in your current activities?
That's interesting. It's like anxiety is prompting us to grow and evolve.
Exactly. It could also be a signal that you're neglecting your own needs and pushing yourself too hard. In that case, anxiety might be a plea for self-care, for setting boundaries, or simply for allowing yourself to rest and recharge.
Or maybe it's a sign that we need to reevaluate our relationships. If we're constantly surrounded by negativity or drama, it's bound to take a toll on our mental well-being.
Absolutely. Jordan Peterson adds another layer to this idea of anxiety as a messenger. He links it to the disruption of our goals. When the path forward becomes unclear or when we're faced with too many choices, that uncertainty can trigger anxiety.
It makes a lot of sense. It's like our brains are trying to figure out the best way forward, and the overload of possibilities creates a sense of unease.
Right. And that ties into the concept of overwhelm, which Psych2Go also mentions. In today's, hyper-connected world, we're constantly bombarded with information and stimulation. It's no wonder so many people are feeling anxious. Our brains simply aren't wired to process that much input all the time.
So maybe anxiety is telling us to simplify, to create more space for stillness and disconnection.
It's definitely something to consider. Now, we've talked about the potential messages behind anxiety, but I'd like to shift gears a bit and explore how it can impact our relationships.
Okay, let's dive into that. I know Psych2Go highlights avoidance as a major factor. It can manifest in avoiding intimacy, difficult conversations, or even relationships altogether.
What's often happening is that people with anxiety are trying to avoid those negative feelings associated with vulnerability and potential hurt. But as many of our sources point out, this avoidance often backfires. It creates more distance and tension in the relationship, which ironically fuels more anxiety.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding things. It can also manifest as overdependence on a partner for reassurance and validation.
That makes sense. When we're feeling anxious, it's natural to seek comfort from those we love. but it can become problematic if it creates an imbalance in the relationship.
Right. Psych2Go also mentions how anxiety can contribute to control issues, perfectionism, and even critical behavior. It's like these anxieties about the relationship create behaviors which actually harm the relationship.
It's fascinating how those underlying fears, those fears of rejection, abandonment, or not being good enough, can manifest in these seemingly unrelated behaviors.
And that's why self-awareness is so crucial. Once we start to recognize how our anxiety is affecting our interactions with others, we can start to develop healthier patterns of communication and behavior.
So we've talked about the different types of anxiety, the possible messages it might be trying to convey, and how it can impact our relationships. But the big question is, what can we actually do about it? What tools do we have to manage anxiety and prevent it from taking over our lives?
Well, that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve into some practical strategies from our sources, from mindfulness techniques to cognitive reframing to lifestyle changes. There's a whole toolbox of approaches out there, and it's about finding what resonates with you and incorporating those tools into your daily life.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to unpacking those strategies with you. So we've explored the many faces of anxiety and how it can show up in our lives. Now let's shift gears and dive into that toolbox you mentioned. Those practical strategies for managing anxiety. Where should we start?
Well, one approach that I find particularly intriguing is this idea of befriending your anxiety. It might sound counterintuitive, but as Tim Bach suggests in his TEDx talk, fighting anxiety often just makes it stronger.
It's like wrestling with a shadow, isn't it?
Yeah.
The more you resist, the more it persists.
Exactly. Instead of trying to suppress it, Tim suggests acknowledging it, listening to its message, and even thanking it for trying to protect you.
Okay. That's a pretty radical shift in perspective. I can see how it could be challenging to thank something that's causing you distress. But I'm curious to hear more about how this approach works.
Well, it's about recognizing that anxiety, while uncomfortable, is not inherently bad. It's a part of us and it's trying to communicate something. By befriending it, we can start to decipher its message and respond in a more constructive way.
So instead of viewing it as the enemy, we're acknowledging it as a part of ourselves that's trying to help, even if it's going about it in a clumsy way.
Exactly. And that leads us to another valuable strategy, mindfulness. This is something that the speaker from My Therapy NYC highlights in their video. It's about tuning into your body, paying attention to your physical sensations, and identifying the emotion that's driving your anxiety.
So instead of getting swept away by those racing thoughts and catastrophic scenarios, you're grounding yourself in the present moment and really feeling what's going on inside. Do you think this approach could be helpful for someone who's prone to overthinking and spiraling into worst-case scenarios?
Absolutely. Mindfulness helps us break free from that cycle of rumination. And often when we tune into our bodies, we find that beneath the surface anxiety, there's another emotion lurking: fear, sadness, anger, or even excitement. Once we identify that underlying emotion, we can start to address it directly.
Yeah. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have to get through the outer layer of anxiety to understand what's really going on underneath. I also like the analogy they used about emotions being like waves, rising and falling. By simply allowing ourselves to feel them without judgment, we can ride them out instead of getting pulled under.
It's a powerful metaphor. Now, speaking of powerful techniques, let's talk about Mel Robbins' 5-4-3-2-1 method. This technique can be incredibly effective for interrupting those anxious thought patterns and grounding yourself in the present moment, especially in those moments when anxiety feels so overwhelming, like waking up with a panic attack.
I've heard about this technique. It's all about engaging your senses.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mel explains that when you're in a state of panic, your body's alarm system is going off, but your mind doesn't have a clear explanation for why. By using the 5-4-3-2-1 countdown and focusing on specific things you can see, hear, touch, smell, and taste, you're giving your mind a reason for that physiological response.
It's almost like you're tricking your brain into thinking, oh, this isn't danger. This is just heightened awareness. I can see how that shift in perception could be really helpful. It's a way of taking control back from the anxiety.
Exactly. Now, Jordan Peterson offers a slightly different perspective on managing anxiety. He emphasizes the importance of confronting your fears head-on. His suggestion is to write down all the things you're afraid of, all the things you're avoiding, and then develop a strategy for gradually tackling them one by one. He even suggests starting with small, manageable steps to build up your courage.
It's like that classic exposure therapy approach, isn't it? You start with something that triggers a mild level of anxiety and gradually work your way up to the things that feel more daunting. Do you think this approach could be applicable to social anxiety? For example, if someone is terrified of public speaking, could they start by having conversations with small groups of friends and then gradually work their way up to larger audiences?
Absolutely. The key is to break down those fears into manageable chunks and create a step-by-step plan. It's about proving to yourself that you can handle those challenges, even if they make you uncomfortable. And as you face those fears and realize they're not as terrifying as your mind makes them out to be, you gain a sense of confidence and resilience.
That sense of self-efficacy is so important, isn't it? It's like that I've got this feeling that comes from facing your fears and coming out on the other side.
Exactly. Now, Peterson also emphasizes the connection between anxiety and physical health, something that's often overlooked. He suggests that sometimes anxiety is a symptom of an underlying physical issue. Addressing those issues, whether it's through dietary changes, managing inflammation, or exploring potential food sensitivities, can have a profound impact on mental well-being.
That's really interesting. I've heard about the gut-brain connection and how our gut health can influence our mood and mental state. But I'm curious, some people might find his suggestions like the carnivore diet a bit extreme. Are there other lifestyle changes that could have a similar impact?
You're right, it's important to find what works for you and consult with healthcare professionals before making any drastic changes. But there are definitely other lifestyle factors that can influence anxiety levels. For example, prioritizing sleep is crucial. Chronic sleep deprivation can wreak havoc on our mental and emotional well-being, making us more susceptible to anxiety.
Yeah, I know from personal experience that when I'm sleep deprived, even small things can feel overwhelming. It's like my ability to cope with stress just goes out the window.
It's not surprising. Sleep is when our bodies and minds repair and recharge. When we're constantly running on empty, our stress response goes into overdrive and anxiety levels spike.
So creating a relaxing bedtime routine, avoiding screen time before bed, and making sure your bedroom is dark, quiet, and cool can all make a difference in managing anxiety.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the power of exercise. Regular physical activity is a fantastic way to reduce anxiety. When we move our bodies, we release endorphins, which have mood-boosting effects.
It's like that runner's high people talk about. I know when I'm feeling stressed, going for a run or a brisk walk can really help to clear my head and lift my spirits.
Exactly. And exercise can also help to improve sleep quality, which, as we discussed, is crucial for managing anxiety. It's a win-win.
So we have all these individual strategies. Befriending our anxiety, practicing mindfulness, using techniques like the 5-4-3-2-1 method, confronting our fears, and taking care of our physical health. But I'm wondering, are there any broader lifestyle changes or shifts in perspective that can help us manage anxiety on a more holistic level?
That's a great question. One thing that often gets overlooked is the impact of our social connections. Supportive relationships can be a powerful buffer against stress and anxiety, while toxic relationships can exacerbate those feelings.
That makes sense. If you're constantly surrounded by negativity and drama, it's going to take a toll on your mental health. But on the other hand, having a strong support system, people you can confide in and rely on, can make all the difference in navigating life's challenges.
Absolutely. Nurturing those positive relationships and setting boundaries with those that drain your energy can be incredibly beneficial for managing anxiety.
It's about creating an environment that supports your well-being, both internally and externally. So it sounds like managing anxiety is not just about these individual techniques. It's also about cultivating a lifestyle that promotes balanced self-care and positive connections.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one person might not work for another. It's about experimenting, finding what resonates with you, and being patient with yourself.
It's a journey of self-discovery, isn't it? And it's about recognizing that we're not alone in this. Millions of people struggle with anxiety, and there's no shame in seeking support and guidance along the way.
You're absolutely right. So I'm curious, from all the strategies and perspectives we've discussed, what stands out to you as particularly helpful or insightful? What resonates most with you?
That's a good question. I think what I find most empowering is this idea that we have more agency than we often realize. It's not about eradicating anxiety altogether, but about learning to understand it, manage it, and even use it as a catalyst for growth.
I love that. It's about shifting our perspective from fearing anxiety to respecting it and even embracing it as a part of our human experience. And for me, the biggest takeaway is the importance of self-compassion.
That's so important. It's easy to get caught up in self-criticism when we're struggling with anxiety. We might blame ourselves or feel like we're not doing enough to manage it. But the truth is, anxiety is a complex emotion, and it's not always easy to control.
Exactly. So instead of beating ourselves up, we can practice self-compassion. We can acknowledge that it's okay to feel anxious, that it's a normal human experience, and that we're doing our best with the tools and resources we have.
I think that's a really important message to leave our listeners with. We've talked about all these strategies and techniques, but ultimately it's about being kind to ourselves, recognizing that we're not alone, and knowing that there is hope. So where do we go from here? What can we explore further in the last part of our deep dive?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in terms of understanding and managing anxiety, but I think it would be valuable to delve into its broader implications. How does anxiety shape our choices? How does it influence our creativity? And how can we leverage its energy in a positive way?
Those are fantastic questions. I'm excited to continue this exploration with you. It's spent so much time unpacking the nuts and bolts of anxiety, what it is, where it comes from, and like how to manage it. But I'm really intrigued by your suggestion that we look at anxiety's broader impact, almost like its ripple effects in our lives.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the immediate experience of anxiety, the racing heart, the spiraling thoughts. But, if we step back, we can see how anxiety subtly shapes our choices, our relationships, even our creative expression.
So how does anxiety influence our decision making? Does it tend to make us more cautious, more risk averse?
That's certainly one possibility. When anxiety is running high, it can narrow our focus, making us hyper-aware of potential threats and downsides. This can lead to what psychologists call avoidance coping, where we shy away from situations that trigger those anxious feelings, even if they might be beneficial in the long run.
It's almost like anxiety creates a kind of tunnel vision, where we're so fixated on avoiding discomfort that we miss out on opportunities for growth and exploration.
Exactly. Think about someone with social anxiety. They might avoid social gatherings, networking events, or even job interviews, even though those experiences could lead to valuable connections, personal growth, or career advancement.
Right. And it's not just about the big decisions, right? Anxiety can seep into our everyday choices, influencing what we eat, how we spend our free time, even how we interact with others.
Absolutely. Someone with health anxiety might meticulously research every ingredient in their food, scrutinizing labels and avoiding entire food groups, even if there's no rational basis for those restrictions.
The anxiety creates this internal filter that distorts our perception and leads us to make choices that ultimately reinforce those anxious beliefs. So if anxiety can have such a significant impact on our decision-making, how does it influence our creative potential? That seems almost contradictory.
It's fascinating, isn't it? We often associate creativity with freedom, spontaneity, a kind of go-with-the-flow energy, and anxiety seems like the antithesis of that. But the truth is, anxiety and creativity are intertwined in complex ways.
I've heard the saying that anxiety is the handmaiden of creativity, but I've never quite understood what that means.
Well, think about the core elements of anxiety. Heightened awareness, a sense of urgency, a deep concern for things going wrong. These same qualities, when channeled in a different direction, can fuel creativity.
Oh, so instead of fixating on potential threats, that heightened awareness can translate into a keen sensitivity to detail, to nuances that others might miss. And the sense of urgency can become a driving force propelling the creative process forward.
Exactly. And that worry about things going wrong can be transformed into a meticulous attention to craft a relentless pursuit of perfection. Think of some of the most celebrated artists, musicians, and writers throughout history. Many of them struggled with anxiety, and yet their creative output was extraordinary. It's almost like they were able to harness that anxiety, that nervous energy, and transmute it into art.
That makes me think of the quote from the poet Rilke, "Live the questions now. Perhaps you will gradually, without noticing it, live your way into the answer." Maybe it's not about trying to eliminate anxiety, but about learning to live with it, to dance with it, to see it as a potential source of inspiration.
I love that. It's about finding that sweet spot, that creative tension where anxiety fuels our passion without paralyzing our actions. And it's important to remember that this isn't just about artists or musicians. This applies to all of us, regardless of our profession or creative pursuits.
So how can we apply this idea of leveraging anxiety's energy in our own lives? What are some practical ways to turn that anxious energy into something productive?
Well, first and foremost, it's about awareness. We need to pay attention to how anxiety shows up in our lives to recognize those patterns of thought and behavior that tend to fuel it. Once we have that awareness, we can start to experiment with different approaches.
So instead of getting swept away by that initial wave of anxiety, we can pause, take a breath, and ask ourselves, what is this anxiety trying to tell me? Is there a way I can channel this energy into something positive?
Exactly. Maybe it's using that heightened awareness to come up with creative solutions to a problem at work. Or maybe it's channeling that nervous energy into a new fitness routine or a passion project you've been putting off.
Yeah. Or even something as simple as writing in a journal or talking to a trusted friend. It's about finding healthy outlets for that anxious energy,
Yeah.
ways to express it without letting it control us.
And sometimes it's about recognizing when anxiety is a signal that something needs to change. Maybe it's a toxic relationship that needs to end, or a job that's draining your soul, or a lifestyle that's no longer serving you.
It's about learning to listen to that inner wisdom, that gut feeling that's telling you something isn't right, and then having the courage to make those necessary changes, even if they feel scary or uncertain. I think that's a really powerful message. Anxiety can be a catalyst for transformation.
It's true. It's about shifting our perspective from viewing anxiety as a weakness to seeing it as a potential source of growth, resilience, and even creativity. And it's about recognizing that we're not alone in this journey.
Exactly. There's a whole community of people out there who are navigating the challenges of anxiety and finding ways to thrive in spite of it. And we can learn from each other, support each other, and celebrate each other's victories along the way.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but I hope our listeners come away with a sense of hope, a renewed sense of possibility, and a deeper understanding of this complex and often misunderstood emotion we call anxiety.
Well, thank you for joining us on this exploration. We encourage you to continue this conversation, to explore the resources we've mentioned, and to keep seeking those nuggets of wisdom that resonate with you.
And remember, you are not defined by your anxiety. You are capable, you are resilient, and you have the power to create a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling even amidst the challenges.
Until next time.